The fallacy that we're examining in this video is one that we can call an argument by cliche. It's got some other names, and we're going to look at that, and we'll also look at what makes it an argument by cliche in the first part of this video. Then we'll go on and look a little bit more closely at the argument structure. We'll talk about why it's actually a fallacy, what's wrong with the reasoning going on in use of cliche or slogan. Then we'll look at several common situations where you should probably be on guard and start thinking about, you're likely to encounter it there. We'll talk about 3 examples of the fallacy. If you want further examples, we'll be loading videos that are just examples later on down the line. We'll talk about how you can spot this fallacy when other people are committing it. We'll talk about what it gets mistaken for, that is, what other fallacies are sometimes mixed up with this one. And then we'll finish by talking about how you can avoid falling into this fallacy in your own inquiry, your own reasoning, your own argument. What is the fallacy of argument by cliche? So first off, I want to say that it's called by several other names in other works. You can see it called argument by slogan. Slogans and cliches are not exactly the same thing, but they're pretty similar. Sometimes it's called the argument by laziness, argument by uninformed opinion, but the laziness and uninformed opinion there are taking the shape of some sort of slogan or cliche, some sort of catchphrase. And so what this kind of fallacy does is, instead of providing any real grounds or adequate grounds to support the claim that's being made in the conclusion, it argues for the claim by substituting some cliche or some slogan or a popular saying or a proverb, whatever it's going to be in there, to make the case. And so it's kind of a short-circuiting of argument in many respects. Let's look at the structure of this fallacy. Now you notice, as opposed to some of the other videos, I don't have, something very, very definite written in here, because this fallacy can take on a lot of different forms. What we've got as a conclusion is you should believe X, where X is something. And one of the premises will be some sort of cliche or slogan, not necessarily mentioning X, but in some way having to do with it. And then the other premise, and there could be more than one other premises, will be something else that is being brought up that has to do with this claim X. But it could be almost anything that you like. So what's getting you from point A to point B in this, from the premise to the conclusion, is that there's some sort of view that we want to get somebody to believe X, and we're going to use something that the crowd, something that the culture provides us with, a cliche, and we throw it out there and we think that that's going to fill the gap. That's the general idea. And if you look at how I've got it diagrammed here, you see something very similar. A pretty simple structure to it. We've got some sort of premise or premises, and then a cliche or slogan thrown in there to kind of shore things up, to kind of smooth things over, and it's supposed to lead somehow to the desired conclusion. So what's wrong with this kind of argumentation? Should we never use cliches? Should we never use slogans? Should we never use proverbs or popular sayings? Well, there's a few things that we want to keep in mind. So, like I put here, many cliches and slogans, they might actually be true in some circumstances. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Okay, that may in fact be true in some cases. It may be a useful guideline. But they're not universal rules the way that they're pretended to be. Universal rules meaning that they apply across the board categorically, no exceptions whatsoever. As a matter of fact, many of them are not even good inductive generalizations. They're fun, they're interesting, they catch our attention, but they may not in fact be reliable. Cliches and slogans may also have very little to do with what's actually being discussed. So that's kind of a problem as well. There's a sense in which when a person has a catchphrase, they want to use it as often as they possibly can. They want to use it in as many contexts, and it may not actually be relevant. So that's one of the problems. And oftentimes a cliche or slogan is being used because the person who's using it thinks that the audience will accept it without thinking about it, because it's popular or because it sounds right to them. That's kind of a danger sign right there. You want, if you're doing critical thinking, you want to be thinking through arguments, not just sort of going on autopilot. And that's what cliches and slogans do for us. So what are some common situations in which you're likely or liable to find an appeal to cliche being made? As I put here, there's all sorts of contexts in which people may bring up a cliche or a slogan or a proverb, but there's certain ones that stand out, I think. Advertising. A lot of advertising budgets go into trying to think up slogans that will grip your attention, and capture your imagination, get you involved, sometimes emotionally, sometimes by, appealing to something from your history, something that appeals to your ideals. Politics, a lot of cliches get used in politics. Debates are a particularly bad case for that. I think back to when Ronald Reagan, it's considered to be a very, stellar moment in debating, but actually from a critical thinking perspective, it would be a good example of an argument or appeal by a cliche. He said to Walter Mondale, "Where's the beef?" And that was taken from a Wendy's ad. So you actually have advertising and politics there at the same time. Marketing and sales closely related to advertising, but if you listen to salespeople's patterns or pitches, they'll often use all sorts of cliches and slogans to try to get the audience, in this case the buyer, off their guard. Both religious and anti-religious groups often have their own particular body of cliches, their own particular body of slogans that they'll use. When it comes to aesthetic matters, so issues of music, issues of fine arts, issues of food and wine, all the lifestyle issues, we might call them. A lot of use of cliches in those, like sometimes in marketing and advertising them, sometimes in discussions about what's good, what's bad, what's cool, what's not cool. People rely on them sometimes in purchasing decisions, which is not a good idea. And I've even heard educators, it's sad to say, whip out cliches every once in a while as a substitute for thinking. Now, many people, and I'm not saying all, I'm not saying most, but many people in our culture rely habitually on slogans and cliches. And what are they looking for from those? They have a kind of soporific effect. They put the mind to sleep. They help you find easy, quick, and unproblematic answers to questions that really ought to be given more robust, more well thought out answers, because they're complicated questions. And some people will also use cliches or slogans to effectively end a conversation, to try to produce consensus, or at least to shut somebody else up. And we're going to look at an example of one of those in just a moment. So here's that example. Example 1. Everybody's got an opinion, I call this one. And I think every one of you has gotten into some sort of discussion or debate with somebody who actually is staking out a position, taking a side, and then when you start to get down to brass tacks, they start backpedaling, and they don't want to listen to evidence, and they say, well, everybody's got their own opinion about things, and I got mine, so I have a right to have my opinion. Now, that is a cliche. That's a great example of something that's a sort of lack of thinking, a sort of going off the board when it comes to following through on thinking, also following through on sort of what we might call the norms for discussion or the norms for argument. So here's an example. Somebody says, hey, I know that you think you're giving me what you call evidence for your position, but it's a free country still, isn't it? Everyone has the right to have their own opinion. Therefore, I don't need to pay any attention to your argument, reasoning, or evidence. And I'm smiling because it's so ludicrous when you actually put it there. But people do this all the time. And those are the two catchphrases that usually go along with it. It's a free country, isn't it? Everyone has the right to have their own opinion. Notice what's being left out in here. Everybody does have the right to have their own opinion. Is that relevant to whether opinions are actually true or false? No, they're being conflated there. And this is an example of sort of sloppy thinking. Another example, and this is one that I particularly dislike because I see people, I'm a medievalist, among other things, and William of Occam is a medieval thinker, and I see him misquoted and misused all the time by people in arguments. So Occam's razor, it actually says that entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. And we could have, there's a whole conversation to have about that. But a lot of people have oversimplified that into the simplest explanation is always the best one. That's the one that's become a slogan. That's the one that's become a cliche. Now, that sort of line of thinking can often get you into trouble. Here's a great example. So somebody says the simplest explanation is always the best one. It's a lot simpler to assume that you're just a dirty cheater than to think that you and your roommate happen to get precisely the same questions right and the same questions wrong on the exam. Therefore, you're a dirty cheater, and I'm going to deal with you and your roommate too. This is one of those sorts of cases where not only is the slogan a misrepresentation of Occam's razor, it may not actually be true. Is it the case that the simplest explanation is always the best one? No. That's not actually the case. And it's interesting in this particular instance because Occam's razor, the real Occam's razor, would say that the simplest explanation is always the best one, is a false statement because sometimes you need to have more entities. Entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. So that means that you're supposed to have as many entities, as many things that you're using to explain things as you actually need. Some explanations don't have enough of those. So perhaps it's actually the case that this is a coincidence, and it would be good to investigate that. The slogan here is being used to sort of, again, short circuit thinking. Let's look at the third example. You gotta do what you gotta do. How many times have you heard that? So this is kind of a common case. When do people actually say you got to do what you got to do? When they're going to do something that they really shouldn't do. Sometimes it's to put up with something that they don't feel like they should put up with, but most of the time it's so that they do something that's morally questionable. So here, this one runs, my friend George and I are up for the same promotion, but there's just one slot, so one of us has to lose out. I guess I could make sure I'd get the promotion if I spread rumors that George is an embezzler. You gotta do what you gotta do. So the conclusion there, and the conclusion is unstated, is I should spread rumors that George is an embezzler. And so, is this good moral reasoning? No. Do you have to do what you have to do? What does that even mean in this case? It means, well, you need to do whatever it's going to require to get ahead, to attain what it is that you want to do. Notice, you could say you got to do what you got to do and actually mean you should fulfill your moral duties. That's not how people usually say it. They use it sort of as a substitute for, well, you got to look out for number one, or you got to look out for your friends and family and forget everybody else. So, again, a bad argument. This is not the sort of reasoning that you want to be using. And what's the real weak point? Well, it's that slogan, you got to do what you got to do. How do you spot this fallacy of argument by cliche? So it's actually pretty simple. Provided you keep yourself on guard against cliches and slogans. So, like I put here, when you hear a person introduce a cliche or slogan into an argument, pay close attention. Start focusing in instead of saying, oh yeah, right, yeah, I got that cliche. Pay close attention there to what it's supposed to contribute to understanding the matter. There's a couple things you should ask yourself. Is the cliche or the slogan actually relevant to the matter that's being discussed or decided? So you can eliminate some right off the bat. So this is where people sometimes, become quite funny. We have comedy routines where somebody's just like a whole bag of slogans and cliches, and they just trot them out, and they don't have anything to do with anything. So if it's something like that, that's pretty easy to spot. Ask yourself also this: does the slogan or the cliche admit of important exceptions, particularly exceptions that might be relevant to the case that you're looking at? And a third thing is, watch out for people who seem to rely an awful lot on cliches or slogans heavily in their own reasoning, decision-making, evaluation, and communication. And I think that if you watch people, you listen to how they talk about things, it's pretty easy to figure out who likes to do this and who is a more critical thinker, paying closer attention to the facts of the matter that you're looking at. Now, I have this section in here about what's not the fallacy of argument by cliche, primarily for students that are taking a critical thinking class or some other class where they need to be able to distinguish fallacies apart from each other, usually in exercises or tests. And there's 3 fallacies that this argument could be mixed up with. As a matter of fact, depending on what textbook you're using, they may in fact roll the argument by cliche into one of these. So one that you can distinguish from it right off the bat is appeal to authority. Arguments that invoke some popular figure who might have coined a slogan or cliche are usually instances of appeal to authority. So if you say that Michael Jordan is saying just do it, and that should apply to how you understand basketball or understand your financial management. Let's use that because he actually does know a lot about basketball, but may not know as much about financial management. I don't really know. I wouldn't consider him an automatic authority in that venue. That's really an appeal to authority. That's not so much a argument by cliche. Another one that it's easy to mix it up with is red herring. And red herring is when you introduce some sort of irrelevant but interesting idea, claim, or consideration that's got nothing to do with what it is that you're discussing, but it'll pull the reader, it'll pull the hearer off to, go sniff that really juicy red herring like a bloodhound that's being pulled off of a trail. And why would this be easy to confuse with argument by cliche? Well, because some cliches may in fact be totally irrelevant. The person may just be throwing it in there. And I suppose you could have some cases where it sort of flips over into a red herring. Another thing that might be going on is somebody might actually try to justify a slogan or cliche by an appeal to popularity. So an appeal to popularity could be rolled in there. A lot of people think that Occam's razor means XYZ. And so now we should apply it in this case. A lot of people think that when it comes to beer, it doesn't get any better than this, Old Milwaukee. So that would be an appeal to popularity instead. Now, not every argument that introduces some well-known or common statement is necessarily the argument or the fallacy of argument by cliche. If you're actually supporting the cliched statement, it could actually be a good part of an argument. So it all depends on what you're doing with the slogan or the cliche. Let's look now at how you can avoid making the fallacy of argument by cliche. One thing that you want to do is start paying close attention to your own claims and arguments and seeing how often, when you're talking with other people, when you're writing, when you're engaging in things, say in comments section, how often when you're making a case are you doing so by bringing up some cliche or some slogan? You also want to see whether you get into the habit of using cliches or slogans to cut off a conversation, to end inquiry, or to try to push away, bat down objections that other people introduce. It's not enough just to give somebody a slogan in response. That's not going to be satisfying to a rational person. When you find yourself, as you inevitably will, using a cliche or slogan to try to decide some matter or as premises in an argument, one of the things you can do is ask yourself whether there's other ways that you could make that case. That would make your argument stronger. That would make you more persuasive to people who aren't just swayed by cliches, but who are more swayed by rational argumentation and evidence. Last thing that I want to say is that this video is part of an entire series discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to a channel that's devoted specifically to critical thinking, reasoning, and argumentation. So if you like this video, or you're finding it useful for your own class or just improving your critical thinking skills, share it with other people and keep coming back. We're constantly adding new content to this channel, so there's going to be a lot of other fallacy videos coming in and a lot of videos about other topics in critical thinking, logic, and argumentation.